fun, hopefully. For those watching the recording, just a very scary voice told us we're being recorded now. But I wanted to start off with a quick question. Hopefully there's no people who majored in fisheries and oceans and fisheries. I think that's the faculty code. But I want you to think of a fish and see if you can come up with a definition for a fish with me. Now, at the onset, it seems very, very simple for us to come up with the definition of fish, something that lives in the water, right? But then all sorts of questions emerge as we try to dig deeper into what we mean by a fish, right? We think, oh, are whales considered fish? They breathe oxygen. They don't have gills like other fish do. Are eels considered fish, right? What about crayfish or starfish, right? Sea stars, actually. But all of these different things, all of these different caveats start to come up as we start to define what a fish is. And fish are generally much less controversial than a lot of the demographic data that we're thinking about. So I always like to start people off when they're thinking about things like social constructs and demographic data to think about something that they can apply to their regular life and hopefully have a fun anecdote. So I like to joke that there's something fishy going on here. Haha, bad pun. No, but when we think about what is a fish, there's all sorts of different caveats that we think about. We think about temperature regulation. Are they chordates like the chord? Do they have gills, scales, or fins, right? So all of these definitions are what scientists start debating about when they start thinking about what is a fish, what isn't a fish. And those sorts of things also start coming up when we talk about a lot of our demographic questions, right? A lot of us will go to, high school or even university level education, and we'll have a simplified understanding of certain things like race or gender, etc. And as the global community is becoming more aware, it's a lot more complicated than that, right? So fish are my sort of introduction into that. And I remember the old statistical adage, which I learned in this very building, is all models are wrong, but some are useful. But we also like to say that some are useful, but some can also be harmful as well, right? So whenever we're using these social constructs, right, we have to think about, is it being harmful or helpful for our communities, right? And so that's something that we do. And then the other piece I always like to bring into people with is the nature versus nurture debate, because that's something I learned growing up, and it's very closely linked to social constructs as well, right? Oftentimes when you tell people something's a social construct, they jump at you and say, what do you mean by a social construct? Everything's socially constructed, or nothing is socially constructed. Gender is a fact of being binary versus being, a spectrum, etc. So the nature and nurture debate is kind of the early vestiges of this discussion, right? Is something innately part of a person, or is it something that is nurtured with them, right? And that is also a construct we have to evaluate, because my background being in biochemistry and looking at psychology as well and neurodegeneration, we talk about how it's never nature or nurture. It's not like a fixed binary between these two things. Often your nature and your nurture have a additive impact on each other, right? So if you think at things like depression, people can be presupposed to be depressed compared to others. And then the environments that they're exposed to can amplify or dampen the effects of things that they're growing up with, right? So these are the different things that we have to think about when thinking about social constructs. So let's break it down into one social construct in particular, which is race and racialization, right? So this, very similar to fish, race is a social construct that we have come up with, and it lacks a clear definition or biological basis. On the surface level, you can think, right, someone's Indian, they grew up in the Indian subcontinent, but when you start looking at it in more detail, it eludes definition, right? It's not something that you can say is a natural construct, that we can very clearly say X and Y, right? If you look at the Indian subcontinent, there's a mix of people that exist. There's variety within what we think of as races, right? And that variation within a race is almost greater than there is between any of the races that we can think about. So this is something that we're often challenged with as well, right? That being said, people are racialized, and that shapes their experiences and outcomes, right? Despite having a clear biological basis, people are grouped into these groupings, and then they experience different treatments. So the picture that I have on the right are all the major famines in India during the British rule. And I like to bring this up because as a South Asian male, I'm 6 times more likely to develop diabetes and insulin resistance than anyone else. Now, the reasons behind this are, of course, debated. And again, there's a nature and nurture discussion going on of what is the interplay between these two things. But, and this will be debated, but there was a lot of mismanagement by the British in India during their time over, and also just importing grain out. So all of these different famines have epigenetic impacts on South Asian peoples, and that predisposes them to be more likely to develop type 2 diabetes because they exist in a world where they had to learn how to keep as much of the glucose and energy that they receive from their foods, right? So despite without having a clear basis, people who grow up as South Asian and from those backgrounds have a shared history that they need to deal with, right? Medically or physiologically or emotionally as well. So despite being a social construct, they have real life ramifications to it as well. And so oftentimes people ask me in my work, well, if race is a social construct, why do you ask questions about race and ethnicity then? Right? Why don't we just get rid of this from the very beginning? And the answer to that is that tackling generations of inequalities based off as a social construct requires us to use those social constructs to understand their experiences, right? To say that, okay, this collective group of people were arbitrarily treated this way, and now they are suffering from this in a group impact sort of way. How can we then help them to do these sorts of things? So there's all sorts of medical innovation happening right now, for example, with women or racialized people, right? To take into account that their experiences in broad strokes are very similar. And we still have to maintain that there's variability within those, but in large chunks, we see that we need to help them in that sense. So we look at all these social constructs and we understand how they have been used or misused, right? There are numerous examples that I'll point to from the grandmother perspective that talk about how demographic data has been used for harms instead, right? And BC for a long time had the policy of a colorblind approach, which said, okay, if this is a problem, let's just eliminate any collection of this data and treat everyone as if they're the same. But that has the very unfortunate consequences of hiding all of the impacts that were differentially felt by these groups of people. So when we look at this data, there's also a need for privacy and anonymity and trust. So I have a whole different presentation on the difference between privacy and anonymity, going into cybersecurity, K-anonymity, et cetera. We won't go into that in too much technical detail because I don't think that was what people are here for. But in order to build trust with the communities that we work with, we want to interrogate what social constructs we have and what their impacts are, right? So we want to engage with the community members that we have and say, this is beneficial to us or this is harmful for us. And it also gives us information about things we wouldn't necessarily know about. I once worked with the RCMP, and we had a cultural sensitivity training. And so one of the things that the person who trained me to talk about was to talk about how in South Asian communities or Muslim communities, men will often not look women directly in the eye. And that is for them a sense of respect, right? To say, we're not staring at you. We want to be, listening to you, but not staring at you. And that's something we raised to the RCMP. And a lot of the officers there were surprised by this fact and they didn't appreciate this. For them, they said, oh, if someone that I'm engaging with me is not looking me in the eye, I take that as a sign of distrust, or they're trying to hide something from me. So I become instantly more suspicious of them. So that sort of cultural knowledge is only gained when you engage with people from those communities to explain that to you, right? This pie in the sky of like, abstracted logic of like, I know everything that's happening, I don't need to ask someone, doesn't really work well for these communities. You have to engage with them and find these different things out. Also, answering the door was another thing the RCMP were quite shocked about. So in your home, you don't have to wear a hijab if you're a Muslim person, but outside you do. So sometimes when RCMP engage with Muslim people, they become very suspicious that someone isn't opening the door for them right away. And it's very simple just to say, hey, actually, they're probably just putting their head covering on. Give them a couple of seconds and it should be fine, right? But this sort of engagement really drives the importance of talking to people before you engage with their data and their communities and stuff. We have a really good partnership at UBC with Indigenous people as well. So when we want to publish any data about the Indigenous community, we engage with them. We say, this is what we're hoping to say. Does this make sense with what you've seen, right? And as statisticians, we always know to talk to domain experts on this sort of thing. So it's just an extension of these really good protocols we have. Another quick note about privacy and anonymity, I just love to plug it in though, is for me, privacy, I define it as having control over what data is collected, shared, and used, right? It tends to be a yes or no thing. Do you want to share this about yourself or no? Whereas anonymity is not having your data linked back to you. So in our research communities, oftentimes we'll have to publish open data sources as well, and we will try to anonymize our data. Right? We'll say we've removed the name, we've put in a bunch of like random numbers and digits, and we believe that's been anonymized, right? But that's not actually the case. There's a whole line of cybersecurity work that gets done around how to break through this, and it requires really, really little amounts of information. I remember one of my favorite projects in the MDS program was cryptography work and breaking through what we thought were secure data sets. And so you could like work backwards and figure out whose information was whose. So cybersecurity, very important part about engaging with demographic data as well. We're seeing across the board in different institutions that people are being less and less willing to share their data, whether in surveys or equity information as well. And part of that has to do with disillusionment with institutions and the protections and privacy that they have in place with that sort of data. So whenever we want to ask for demographic data, we really want to say, how are we protecting that data? How are we making sure that you aren't being exposed by providing that as well? I see a red sign in the thing. Okay, sounds good. Screen share is working. Perfect. Okay. So one of the other challenges that we face when we're looking at demographic data is low-end populations. And one of the groups most affected by that in my work is gender and sexual orientation minorities as well. So in the past, we operated very much on a binary perspective of gender, where we had men and women, and other orientations, other gender identities would often be conflated within that and be absorbed as noise. So whereas now we want to appreciate that there are separate populations that we want to study. However, these are relatively low, much smaller populations than men and women, right? I think around UBC, there's somewhere around 1% of staff and employees self-identifying as other gender identities, 1 to 2%. And there's a tendency, especially for statistical reasons, to forego these smaller populations, as there's more statistical power in larger groups. But smaller groups need visibility because precisely that they are smaller groups. Their voices are less predominantly heard. So it is our job to amplify these voices despite having not a strong a number in our data sets. And yeah, this is my very funny comment about the tyranny of majority. If you've ever read John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, this is the issue of you don't want in a truly just society, you don't want just the majority to have their opinions heard, right? You want the minorities to have that heard as well. And it's very funnily illustrated by this wolf and this sheep. That's the wolf asks the sheep, "Can I eat you?" The sheep says no. And because it's a one-to-one, it's, it cancels out. So the wolf invites their friend and says, "Hey, can we take a vote on if I can eat you or not?" And the minority group is like, "Well, no, that doesn't really work," right? So just because you have more people saying something does not mean that they should win out in that vote. That is a very common fallacy of ad populum fallacy as well, for the logic friends. Oh, whoops. So that is something that we want to make sure that we amplify. We All Count is a really good website with people writing articles that are trying to think about how to engage with small n intersectional and equity data as well. So there's a lot of really good resources on there about how to engage. And one of their key advices is that even if you may not have the same confidence intervals or statistical significance, you should still try to represent those communities in some way, right? Even if it's so much to say that we weren't able to report on how these group of people felt because there's not enough people, but they tended to feel, worse or better than whatever comparator groups that you might want to present. And I'm going to take a quick second to breathe. Any questions so far in the chat or Zoom? Yes. We All Count. I'll have it shown up soon as well. Hi. Would you like me to go?
The challenge with low end
Mm-hmm.
Particularly for, say, well, I don't know, is that sometimes it's hard for them to identify us.
Mm-hmm.
Privacy. And then it puts in this bind where one people stay, but they don't identify as such.
Yeah. How do you manage that? Well, the way that we've tried the best to manage that and what's worked is building trust over time, right? So UBC has very, like if you take the equity survey for UBC or the student version that's now being piloted, it has a long blurb about how we're going to make sure that data is protected, who's allowed access to it, when it will be retained for, what uses it will be used for. So that sort of transparency goes a long way in engaging with these communities and saying, hey, we will be very respectful for how it's used. If you reach out to me in the equity office for that data, so you may feel like there's a lot of roadblocks that come in to say, have you got this approval or what are you using it for? And that's all in place to say, we take this very seriously. So there's no sudden response that will make people more comfortable answering, but that sort of work is very critical, right? Things like hiding data that is under a certain number of people, being aware of who gets to see that information. Is that someone in a position of power or authority over you as well? For example, in hiring committees, right? Does like when someone applies to a role at UBC, if it's a tenure track position, then the entire faculty should not get to see your equity answers. Maybe one or two people that may not have hiring decisions can put a place in that sort of thing. So all those sorts of setup beforehand is very critical to get people to engage with you as well. And you'll be able to see well, you won't be able to see, but I get to monitor what people put in for prefer not to answer, right? So for different questions. So we'll see that for race, people are more willing to disclose, partially because that's also very visible, right? Like I can't really hide the fact that my skin color is not white, but other more invisible disabilities, you'll see more people, not willing to disclose. So it is a challenge, totally. And we just have to work on building that trust and showing that we are taking it seriously. So that's it. Okay, with that, I will keep going. So again, this is from We All Count, which is kind of hard to see. But they have a great article about I'm not just an asterisk. And this is the whole idea around hiding or including data that doesn't have enough response values to it. And it is a balancing act that we must do, right? Humanity is a continuum of very many identities that overlap, right? And in our attempt to make it easier to understand, we make them into discrete buckets, right? And no matter what we do, we will always be making them into buckets, even if they're slightly smaller buckets, right? It's a fundamental part of statistics and data analysis that we need to group people into larger groups in order to analyze them, right? But the question we need to ask is, when do we bucket people together, and when do we, expand and have more detail? And it is a balancing act. And people often try to ask me for a one-bullet solution that they can apply to every different situation. And what I like to tell them is the choice to aggregate should be made on the basis of the response profiles for the questions at hand, right? So if we're looking at the for added emphasis, let's say. So when we're looking at certain questions, we want to see how are people responding, right? For sexual orientation, in terms of acceptance, you'll find that certain groups of people feel much more accepted than others from within the sexual orientations that exist, the minoritized ones. So it's potential that you group the ones that are feeling more in line with each other together, and say for the reasons of having a stronger N or more statistical significance, we've seen that people who are X and Y orientation are feeling more accepted, and those that are not are these ones, and they're feeling less accepted for whatever reason, right? Same goes with racialization as well, right? It can be one avenue of increasing your N and your surety in the answer. But it is also, again, important to explain why that aggregation was made before or after the survey, right? Equity surveys are often a chance for people to express their distinctness to the institution that they're reaching out to, right? So even though it may not be something we're looking for in our analysis, it may be too detailed, there's always that personal connection aspect where they're feeling they're being listened to, they're being able to tell people who they really are, right? So it is very important for us to explain why we're aggregating at the level we are. Are we just looking at racialized folks, or are we breaking it down by certain ethnic groups? Why are we not including other ethnic groups, right? So it's always really good to say, for sexual orientations, we're not going to break it down at this level, we're going to break it down to this level, right? And that goes a really, really long way in explaining things. And that can be done after the survey as well, right? Maybe we're very, very excited and think we can get a large number of people from many different groups, and then we end up realizing that no, we can't actually do that. We have to aggregate people together. So before you aggregate, you want to make sure that it doesn't make sense to aggregate these groups together, right? Is there an underlying component that says, these two groups of people can be combined? If they're saying wildly different things, like one group is like super positive, one is super negative, you want to avoid grouping them together, because what you're going to do is you're going to regress to a mean answer from them, and then that's not going to give you any sort of meaningful information either. Yeah, and provide some sort of insights. Even if it's not a figure, maybe you can say people tended to be more negative than our comparator groups, type of thing. And so when we're talking about aggregation or not, the next thing that always comes up is intersectionality. So intersectionality is also very, very important, and things that we're missing. I'm assuming a lot of us are stats friendly, so I like to explain to everyone that we like to we want to think of intersectionality as interaction effects in statistics speak, right? It's not just race plus gender, it's race times gender, right? We want to understand what the additional impacts that happen from combining these two identities together will have. So if you're reaching out to statisticians, you can use interaction effects. I love coming up with metaphors for people based on the disciplines that they're in. So this is again from We All Count. It's a bit more of a fun image than we're thinking about, but this is one way that they presented how to look at intersectional identities. Now, I wouldn't do it this quite way, because having multiple colors in a pie chart just rubs me the wrong way. But you can see that very much that they're saying the number of marginalized identities versus their predicted probability of political protest, right? So that is one way that people present intersectionality, is to count the number of intersectional identities they have. The downside of this approach is that you have no idea what these multiple intersectional identities may be, especially when you're looking at a large institution like UBC, right? It could be sexual orientation plus disability. It could be being a woman plus being, racialized, for example, or some combination of it, right? So the downside here is that your population that you've grouped together now is very heterogeneous, right? It's not one simple population. Another approach that I prefer is to look at larger common demographics that can be pulled out for intersectionality purposes. So women and racialized women in particular can often be presented in an intersectional way, right? So you have men, women, and then you have racialized women in particular, right? Because race and gender, especially the men and women, often have enough people in their end that you can present those two groups separately. But it is very interesting data. It really depends on who your demographics are, and something that UBC is working on. And we'll have interesting information out soon with the student demographic project. Yeah, that's the question. And if anyone's read John Green's A Fault in Our Stars, another really bad pun, A Fault in Our Algorithms, is another interesting thing that I really like to talk about when we talk about demographics, is that we often hope that computers will remove our biases, but often it ends up absorbing those biases into the process itself. So we're going to talk about digital redlining really quickly. Redlining was a process back before the civil rights movement, where people would say, these neighborhoods are more dangerous, at risk, and we won't insure mortgages to people who live in these neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods were specifically constructed because of segregation that had Black homeowners there, or Black people living in those areas, right? And so what the implications of that into the modern day is that America is still highly segregated despite not having those same segregation laws. People are forced to live, people are generally living in those areas that they were pre-segregation as well, just because it's more difficult to move out of those neighborhoods, for example. You do have some movement, but still schools, neighborhoods are often very much divided around racial lines as well. And so what, for example, the mortgage industry does is says, hey, we'll use a computer to remove racial bias when we're doing our calculations and our work. But the computer starts picking up on these red line districts that have existed historically in the data. And now the computer is unbiasedly assigning mortgages to people and not to other people. But it is falling around the same racial biases that existed because of redlining. So when we do analysis, we have to really understand what the history of that data is. Oftentimes people love to start discussions around equity with, let's all be fair starting now. But the world doesn't work that way, right? There's not time equals zero. It's time equals whatever, 10,000 years of human history, right? And we need to be aware of what biases already exist in the data and what steps we might want to take to address them, or at least acknowledge them, right? And not attribute them to race reasons, but to, the impacts of racialization that have had long-lasting inputs past their time. And a plug for Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, if you want to read more detail. She has a really, really good book on how search engines, and in particularly Google, because of all the Google colors, and how they bias the search results that people see, right? So when we talk about the elections in the United States, I feel it's because I'm kicking this cord, so I'm going to step slightly to the right. So talk about how echo chambers are created and how they're amplified by these search engines, and how these search engines are not the unbiased systems that we think they are. They're engaged to make things more racialized than they necessarily need to be. So if you type in why are black women so blah, and let Google fill in the blanks, you'll see very different results than if you type in why are white women or why are women like this, right? There's a very clear difference in what material is presented at the top of the list. And it's not just because that's what people are looking for, right? They're being primed to see these things. And then they take that to mean that that is just the natural state of things as well. Okay, so those were all the issues with recoding demographic data, the different things we have to think about. There's, of course, a lot more to talk about as well. I see Katie looking at her watch, so I'm not sure if I'm good on time, but I think I'm okay. We're going to talk quickly about some of the frameworks we can look at as well to help us with this, because a quick presentation by me is clearly not enough. So there's two mottos that I think that are very important for us to have in our minds when we think about. The first is nothing about us without us. So this was really championed in the disability community first. And it is basically what I've been harping on for most of this presentation. If you're going to do something, you should ask the domain experts about their lived experiences to help understand why those things are happening. My example with Muslim people and how they react to certain things are different. And that's not something someone would know off the top of their hand, but someone who is Muslim would be able to share that sort of information with you, right? Engage with the communities you want to work with. Pretty simple. And the second is free, prior, and informed consent. And this is, I believe, very much championed by the indigenous peoples as well. And it has three very key messages in consent that apply to all types of consent. One is free. So if you have a gun at my head and say, hey, are you okay with this? I'm going to say yes, but that's not the type of yes you really want to hear from people, right? Prior is another thing as well. You want to ask them before you collect this data, right? I mean, it's better late than never, but you want to collect that permission beforehand. And they'll be able to guide you on the pitfalls and other confounding variables that might be at play. And then the last is informed. If you explain something to someone and they have no idea what they're talking about, it's not really consent. You just said a bunch of words and they said yes, and there was no, understanding. That time I did not kick the cord. But that very much is when you go on Facebook or any one of our social media platforms and they're like, do you agree to the terms and service? And you say yes, you are not very much informed, right? I don't know if we should have a skill testing question about the terms of service before you say yes, but I feel like people would feel very differently about signing up for things if they had that option, right? And you'll see the movement to a lot of organizations having a quick, easy to read version of terms of service. And that shows a real initiative from them to say, we want you to understand what you're signing up for. And instantly you will build that trust to say, okay, I'm more likely to share my information with you because you're trying to be upfront with me. But if you get those like, here's 300 pages, terms of service, please say yes. Like, I don't know what I'm agreeing to, but I really shouldn't do that, right? So those are the two mantras that you should have when taking place in any sort of research in this sort of way. The next thing is a very local document, so I love plugging it, is the grandmother perspective. And it is a local framework on how to use demographic data. So if you're not aware, BC recently passed the Anti-Racism Data Act, or ARDA for short, I like to call it. And building on that, the grandmother perspective talks about how to use demographic data, especially disaggregated data. And BC is really trying to switch how it's using this information and making sure that it's doing it in a respectful way as well. I think it's very approachable, clear, and educational. There's lots of examples on both the benefits and the dangers of using demographic data with examples. So if anyone asks you, oh, what's the worst that happened? You can point to many stories of how it's been misused, both in Canada and in the US, right? Oftentimes, we lack the Canadian context for a lot of our stories because the Americans tend to have a worse job of it. But those sorts of issues also occur in Canada as well. And it's important that we know that and we break down the fallacy of like, this stuff only happens in America, Canada's great, and we're all nice and we never mess anything up type of thing. So I'll do a quick look at the grandmother perspective, just to help plug it a little bit more. So it is a long document, but you can read the executive summary at the very least. And hopefully I can jump to the top. Can I? Yes, here's the preview bar. Oh, we should have said that. Yay. Okay. So it's a really great document. You can talk about the project, the background, the tools, the purpose, the process, what the moving forward, what the recommendations are, what the ADDA is and data standards, etc. So it's a really good document, very very nice and colorful and button clicky and stuff. So you can have these different quotes and whatnot as well. But thank you so much. If you have any questions, please let me know. Yeah. The Coil version. And I will look. Thank you so much for sharing the website as well, Katie. Weallcount.com.
I don't know, is this thing working? Do we know? Okay, does anyone have any questions? And maybe we'll do the in-person questions first, if anyone has any questions. I'm getting something on.
No. Hi. Yes, please.
Just wondering when you say the bias being absorbed by the algorithm, and I think just get a little bit nervous on those kind of things. When you say it's biased, and so you have to define what is biased first. That it seems to me a lot of time it is like simply some outcome you don't like, and they say it's biased.
Yeah. So to add on to that, yeah, I think what we mean by bias is that the data exists in a way that has unintended consequences for us, right? So we are expecting the decisions to be rendered not through a racial lens, right? For example, but the data, the way that it's encoded, when we process it, we see the data coming out within racial lines as well.
But sometimes the correlation with the causation of the different things.
Yes.
That this is really looking at the different background. For example, you're talking about the models.
Yes.
It's needed to this area of the city when for the goal. Then
Yeah.
so if that happens to be city people.
Yes.
It's hard to say it's because they live there, therefore.
Yeah, so we always have to take into account the other scholarly research that exists, right? So a lot of the times when we look at real life examples, right, we'll make correlation little things, but we can't make those causal statements, right? Because we don't know, is it because race or is it because of the situation that's occurred? But when we look at other studies, we can look at controlling for things like socioeconomic status, controlling for income disparity in the place that people are living, that we don't see a clear race as the reason for this, and the data is explained through other factors. So then when we look at real life correlations, the risk we run into is that people will make aspersions about race and say that this is not because of socioeconomic status or whatever, but people are just naturally less gifted or intelligent or that sort of thing. So that's what I mean by bias. Maybe my language is not as precise as it should be, but I think as scientists and people in academia, we have to think about when we publish something, like what is being understood by it, right? Have we explained the potential for confounding variables, or do we just publish the data and say, you know, Black people are less able to afford mortgages because of where they live, right? Instead of saying, this is what we're seeing, but we have no evidence that, you know, race is an implication on this. There's other confounding variables that matter as well that we should look at. And a lot of people don't do that. And that's something we should keep in mind. Hopefully that makes sense. Katie.
I know this is kind of secret, so I don't know how much you can say, but I was curious if you could give us just even a little glimpse of the student demographic project?
Sure, it's not secret, it's just not finalized yet. And so we don't want to share anything before it's finalized. But the student demographic project was launched by the EBC community to say we want to ask our demographic questions in a better way. So there was a large amount of consultations over 2 years or so, and then we just piloted that survey this fall to students. And those questions are asking much more detail than we've ever asked before. And we're trying to strike the right balance between how we've asked those questions, what data we're seeing, what students are writing in about what their identities are. So we haven't finalized what it looks like yet. So I don't want to say what we've done so far. But if you have any questions, you can go online and look up the student demographic project. And there's a lot of material on there, and there's also an email where you can email us and we can give you an official answer. But hopefully we'll take a look at that, refine whatever questions we need to, and roll that out widely. And then we can use that to support a lot of the initiatives that we want to take on. Because I know Skylight often says we don't have this data on equity. So how do we look at how students are doing based on these sorts of demographic variables? What we're working on.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. Sure.
Do you have information if those questions are very different from like the demographic questions like in the NBC survey or?
So this year, what we did with the student demographic questions is we included them into the NEDI UBC and the UES. So for the UES, we actually referred students to fill out the student demographic census instead. And then we'll be able to use that data. The reason we did that is to reduce survey fatigue, right? Like where every single time the students have to fill out their answers. But if we have a central repository, we can link it back without asking them 16 times if they're, racialized or not type of thing. So that's the goal and the intent eventually as well. But they are subject to revision as we're revising and taking in feedback from students about how they're composed and stuff. So they're not final yet, but will be soon. Yeah. Anything else?
I thought that, sometimes qualitative data, I mean, not always qualitative data is equal to statistical data and or like quantitative data, right? So
Yes.
Yes. But with new kind of like technology like AI or whatever, analyzing data, hopefully unbiased kind of way. Do you see in the future maybe like more qualitative whether the surveys or like methodologies are kind of coming into our fields like science and engineering?
Yeah, I think there's a potential for it to be used really, really well. But there's also a thing to keep in mind, right? Like as we get better and better technologies to do like machine learning, supervised learning, and all these sorts of things, it's great. We get really, really large data sets, but we will also have that same disparity that exists between more common groups than less common groups, right? And the fear that I have is that we always forget about the smaller groups because we have a stronger end to work with, right? So it just requires us to be more mindful, right? Which is not to not do these analyses, just to make sure that those smaller groups are still represented when we talk about it and we think about the different confounding variables that exist. But with these technologies, I think recommender engines are very interesting because we had an ethics course in our MDS program, and I had a very interesting colleague, and we discussed preferences, like for example, Amazon or whatever, right? And to say, okay, so if you have an Indian person and they grew up eating butter chicken all their life, they like butter chicken. So they go online and Amazon says, hey, this person's from India, they probably eat butter chicken, right? And it recommends them butter chicken, but it never recommends them anything else, right? And so the system then thinks, oh, Indian people only like butter chicken. Let's only give them butter chicken. Let's give them nothing else but this dish. But that doesn't mean that I couldn't like, spaghetti or lasagna or what have you, right? But because our systems are trained to always just give you what you want or what you know about, it limits our ability to expand and grow, right? And that's my concern with a lot of these recommender engines with ChatGPT. Like if sorry, if ChatGPT keeps mining what we say and we keep using ChatGPT to generate content, then ChatGPT at one point will be mining itself for its own content. So that sort of, iteration and process is somewhat concerning to me to think about, right? And yeah, essentially creating these racial disparities rather than removing them. So in the more open space, there are ways to like counter this by having some amount of newer variety of material coming out. So I think like Apple Music has a specific channel for like, do you want to explore something new type of thing? And so those are ways you can try to do it. But you have this clash between capitalism and monetary money making, right? Like, who cares if there's a racial disparity? We don't want to give loans to these people because, we make less money off of it. So let's just reinforce these racial disparities. So it is a societal reckoning to say, if we see these discrepancies in our data, will we try to circumvent them, or will we just lean into them and say that's how it is and just keep going with it? So it really depends who's in charge and who pushes back on stuff.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
All right, and for those, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, if you have any questions, you can email the Equity Inclusion Office. If it's about the student demographic project, you can email them directly as well, which will partially be me, and we'll be able to respond to your questions about that as well. Thank you so much. And I'll let
Thank you.
Susan
And
close up.
for those of you in person, we have lunch. So yeah, if you want to chat more, we can chat about other things, just hang out and have lunch. That would be great till about 12:30. So thank you. I'm just going to stop the Zoom meeting then if there's no questions there. Thank you, everyone.
Lunch. We set it out outside, so you can just go out and grab it if you want to come back.